You watched all of this yesterday. I watched all of this yesterday. There seems to be very mixed impressions about whether this was impressive or whether this was something else.
Well, Phil hits on this really interesting point. Most of the companies that are doing this technology are focused in on confined areas. When asked about that yesterday, he was talking about this could go anywhere and everywhere.
Wide, right.
And that level of autonomy, no company in the world has demonstrated that ability. And the idea that he's going to roll this out next year is, for some, hard to believe.
So the question, though, is you looked at the technology, you looked at what he talked about. They got into the weeds, right? They talked about the chips. They talked about how the cameras work. They talked about the reason and rationale for not using LiDAR. Did you listen to that and say, he's on to something? Or did you say, this is smoke and mirrors?
I've heard similar presentations from other companies for years. And it's interesting to hear their thought process and some of the details that they're doing. But that said, the idea of a level 5, the ability of autonomy to go anywhere and everywhere, is among some experts something that they don't see for a generation rolling out, let alone in the next 12 months.
So what do you think gives him the confidence to say that?
It's unclear. Some of it is his hope and his ambition. If you look past in Tesla, there's always what could potentially roll out.
Did you look at that, though, and say he does have an advantage? I mean, this was a full-day demonstration to try to persuade the public, and I imagine investors, more importantly, especially ahead of what some people think are going to be troublesome earnings, to say, don't even think about us as a car company anymore. Actually, think about us as something else, and it might be a couple of years from now, but as a company that competes almost with an Uber.
Right. Here's one of the things. You take a step back, it's almost like a classic old Detroit technique here with a silicon twist. Because when automakers are facing slowdown in demand, they often push the lever of fleet sales, pushing car sales out to rental car companies and taxi companies. The change here is he wants to put that demand into a robot taxi fleet. So it would help sales in the immediate term.
Phil, what did we learn about profitability yesterday, if at all? Or is that an issue for Wednesday, or did we get some comments that make profitability now tied to the robo-taxis as opposed to how we thought about it 6 months ago, just the sort of regular Model 3 sales?
He threw out some numbers in terms of potential profitability per vehicle if the robotaxi fleet were to take off. But you can't, there's nothing you can ascribe to that, Wilf. There's nothing you can look at and say, oh, yeah, they're definitely going to be making X dollars per share or per vehicle by 2021, 2022. All of that is contingent upon how the vehicle is used, where it is used, the number of people who might theoretically be using the Tesla autonomous network. And to Tim's point about whether or not you buy into this, the key point here is what happens in that last, I call it the last block, where you're pulling into your neighborhood, where you're turning into a driveway, where you're turning into a parking lot, let's say at a Quick Mart, and somebody walks out, or a kid's on the bike and walks out. Those are so tricky.
But here's the thing, and this is what
technology.
I wanted to understand, but both from you, Phil, and from you, Tim, were you persuaded that he has, and this is Elon, has somehow either cracked the code on hardware in terms of this chip that he argues is faster than anything else that's ever been made? He says it's empirical. That's the case. Nvidia, of course, on the other end says that's just fundamentally not true, and that you're comparing, apples with oranges on one end. That his camera system is and the software behind it is more effectively than LiDAR. I mean, these are the things he's put out there and said, look, if he can get these things right, he thinks he is way ahead of everybody else. And what I'm trying to understand is the market doesn't seem to be convinced. You've talked to lots of computer scientists and other people who specialize in this area. Do they look at this and go, wow, that's impressive, or something else?
I think you just hit on it. The market clearly is yawning at it. And the one thing that was interesting is the dive into the data they're pulling off of those vehicles. So you can see the routes that people are taking, and they can learn from that. That is useful information. The idea of avoiding LiDAR and developing your own chip, I think it gets to the kind of this key thing that the industry hasn't quite come to a consensus on exactly how they're going to roll this technology
out. Hey, Phil, do you believe one of the things actually that I saw a lot of commotion among the computer scientists out there was this idea that they were actually taking video from the cars, but doing it selectively and looking only for specific actions, meaning using machine learning to say, today we need to look for images of tires that are left on the road. Don't send us everything because that takes up too much bandwidth. Only send us stuff when you see that. And they are sending it. Do you believe that? Because there's a lot of people I've seen online that are skeptical about that.
Well, whether or not they're doing that, do I believe that, or do I believe
whether they're able to selectively do it that way?
Well, they say that they are.
Right.
I mean, I've heard the people who have said, there's no way you can do that. Their rationale for doing that, as you heard, Andrew, in the presentation yesterday was, look, if we were to take reams of data of any time a vehicle of ours is going down the street and it's feeding it an image, it's overload. It's just pushing too much into the sewer pipe, if you will. Instead, they believe that by selectively choosing certain elements allows you to say, okay, this makes sense. This is how a vehicle should react in this particular situation.
Right. But I mean, this idea that he effectively thinks that every car can effectively become retrofitted, if you will, as a robo-taxi, arguing that all of the hardware is already on the car itself for the most part, those that have been sold on the S and some of the others, and then the Model 3. Is that realistic to you? Because the other thing that Nvidia, by the way, some of these cars are using Nvidia chips, and Nvidia says the chip isn't even supposed to be used that way.
I thought, for me, the most interesting part were the claims that their technology and their chipset is way better than Nvidia's. Nvidia wasted no time pushing back and saying, oh, no, 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 no. That is not the case. And we haven't heard from anybody, any of the analysts or experts in the arena who have said, oh, yeah, they are light years ahead of Nvidia. So far, what I've heard has been sort of a muted, let's look into this a little bit more. I want to see how that plays out over the next couple of days as people look at these claims relative to Nvidia.
Tim, help us with this. The hardest part about Tesla is that no matter what they say, it feels like on one side, people say, oh, these numbers are real, and on the other side, they say, no, these numbers are fake, which is very different than usually, there's a market, if you will, for people being bullish and bearish, and usually it's they look at the numbers and they say, I feel more comfortable about assigning a higher value or less comfortable about assigning a higher value. It's not usually about adjudicating the numbers or the what's actually happening itself. And that's the hard part for investors today.
Absolutely. And the challenge here also is 2016, Elon Musk made similar comments about the technology in his cars. He said the vehicles were rolling out and they would be able to be fully self-driving. They had the hardware in place, and it was just going to be a software update and regulators' approval. And it was going to be demonstrated by the end of 2017. It didn't happen.
Do you think that regulators will ever take action on these type of prognostications? There are ongoing investigations at Tesla today, correct?
There are.
There are. For?
Reporting, there's been investigations into the comments about production. We've reported that. There's been comments. We've got a fight with the SEC right now over his comments about production on Twitter. Those are ongoing.
And what's your expectation just for tomorrow? Not to make it a short-term conversation, but people are focused on tomorrow in a very big way.
I think the big question is going to be cash. Is he going to raise? Is he got enough to get through the year?